It's my great honor and pleasure to have Professor Dr. Iver Neumann as my first guest in this channel. Professor Neumann is a director of Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Norway. Welcome. It's so great to see you.
Good to see you, Alisha. It's about time. I mean, we've been discussing diplomacy off and on now for, I think, more than a decade. So
That's right. That's right. Let me start from asking about your current research projects.
I've been doing sort of diplomacy studies since the 1990s. And when I started, it was first and foremost a question of finding out what are diplomats actually doing, because there was a literature there, but it was almost all written by former diplomats themselves. Harold Nicholson's books would be a typical example of this. And they were informative. They were also somewhat grand, and they took a lot of stuff for granted. So coming in as a social scientist, the first question was, what are these people actually doing? Since then, we have been able to sort of come up with quite a scientific literature, something to be proud of. And my project now is more on a specific thing, which is which kinds of new stations can we use in diplomacy? Particularly for countries like Uzbekistan and Norway, we are not exactly swimming in resources in diplomacy. So we have to make do with rather small stations and delegations. And Norway has therefore experimented with all kinds of different formats. We have had regional hubs, where the idea was that we would be, for example, in West Africa, we would be in one capital and then have the person there side accredited to other capitals in the region so that then they would be within easy travel reach. So side accreditation is, of course, well tested in diplomatic history, but this was side accreditation by someone who was already there. Then we would have what was often called computer stations, where the idea was to send one person with a computer, and he or she would basically be living in an hotel and trying to run a station from there. And then there would be the home-based ambassador. As seen from Norway, the Caribbean is a region with a lot of countries, but we don't have all that many contacts with the Caribbean. So we sort of experimented with having one diplomat sitting in Oslo and then traveling to the different states in the Caribbean. And we also actually did that where Central Asia is concerned. So I'm trying to do a sort of lesson learned thing based on interviews with people who've been filling these posts to find out what are their reactions and what are their experiences. And the reason why this is of interest is that larger countries are now coming to a point, reaching a point where they think that they would try this. And then I think that there might be an interest in seeing what another state has been learning from this. It is, of course, a problem in diplomatic studies that most of us simply have to study the country that they know best, because in order to get access to interviews, and particularly to participant observation, you have to work with the people from the state you're based in. So that is a bias, but I still think it is of interest because diplomats always make a point of mirroring one another and following one another's practices. So that's...
that's... So I understand this is a very practical-oriented research.
Yes, it is. It's hands-on, and it gives me a chance to work with my Norwegian colleagues here in Norway. I also have a very unpractical project, which is about the diplomacy of the so-called Amana system. This is a system of large civilizations, the Hittites in Anatolia, Babylonia and Assyria, in Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and a number of other smaller states, for example, one based in Cyprus called Alasia. And there was even one which is Mycenaean Greece. And in the period from around 1600, 1650, before the Common Era, until the Bronze Age collapse around 1200, there was a thriving system. And people who study diplomacy have taken an interest in this because of a number of letters that we found that written by a specific pharaoh, a revolutionary Egyptian pharaoh, Akhenaten. But we now have enough archaeological material and also written material, actually, so that we can construct this diplomatic system as it existed over a period of almost 500 years. So I think this is very interesting research because it excavates the basics of diplomacy, the kind of stuff that has always been around. Of course, nothing has always been around, but for example, through the years, through all this period, every single diplomatic letter will start by asking the health of the other ruler, and then go into the wishing health to his wives and to his children and to his horses and to his people, and so on and so on. So they even were in the habit of inviting one another to birthdays, although and to different kinds of rituals. So the deceit was that they were living in a village next door, as it were. So this tells us something about steady elements in diplomacy that will not go away anytime soon.
Very interesting. So, of course, you are very famous with your research and publications in international relations, in diplomacy, and also in social anthropology. And I see now you are going deeper in history and also in archaeology. Is it a right observation?
Yes, it is. And the reason for that is that since people started to dig systematically for what happened in the distant past, and that is, after all, not all that long ago, it was in the second half of the 1800s, so it's about 150 years ago, and archaeologists have come up with so much material, written data and also material data, and that we are able to construct social realities for a long period of time that we didn't know all that much about before. And I feel as a social scientist that it's my duty that I should take a look at this because very few other social scientists have done so. So we talk a lot about so-called presentism in the social sciences, that we're only interested in the world as it is now. And this is true. And there's a good reason for it, which is that social sciences were created in order to be a counterpoint to history. So we should not be ashamed that we started as a fairly ahistorical undertaking, but I think that we cannot maintain this. If we're supposed to say something about the human condition at large, then we have to relate to all human societies in all different time periods, I think, although that is, of course, a tall order. It is doable.
Yeah, very interesting. There is a growing interest in diplomacy, it seems to me. Diplomatic studies are booming, if I may say so. So how would you evaluate the status of diplomatic studies now? And there are a lot of new approaches, new theories, new concepts are emerging in this field.
Yes, I would agree with that. And the first job was to apply sort of standard social science thinking to diplomacy. I mean, you have a Weberian approach, a Durkheimian approach, and then the list goes on with newer theorists, Bourdieu, Foucault, etc. But we now have a lot of readings of diplomacy from these different standpoints, and that's an enrichment. The point here is, of course, not to that these theories will change how we think about diplomatic activity forever. It's a question of giving a more nuanced picture from different perspectives. And we also have a number of people working on this from outside of the United States and Britain, which is very nice. I still think that what you and other people who are not working in the West are doing is of particular importance, because there is a bias in the literature that the Western way of doing diplomacy is being studied very thoroughly, whereas other things go unnoticed. And the result of that would be Eurocentrism, putting Europe at the center of attention, both in the present day and historically, and this would be bad science. So I think the major challenge now is simply to diversify the study of diplomacy. And I think a particularly interesting new shelf in the literature on diplomacy concerns relations between states that exist in different regions of the world, but none of which would be Western. That's quite interesting. So, for example, Colombian-Korean relations, that kind of thing. I think they enrich us by demonstrating what is general to diplomacy today and what is simply Western diplomacy, as it were.
Could we say now that we have now, at this stage, some sort of new understanding of diplomacy to compare with the old understandings? Anything new you see happened which could give us some new insights, new approaches to diplomacy?
That's a big one. Well, everyone studying diplomacy and everyone doing diplomacy knows Satov's Guide to Diplomatic Practice, which is a very nice book that is now out in, I think, 7 different editions over the last 100 years. And it's a cookbook for how to do diplomacy. But the definition of diplomacy there, that diplomacy is bringing tact to the relations between states. That is an example of something that is not necessarily true. If we take diplomacy between Greek city-states, for example, threats were simply a part of the conversation. And it didn't lead anyone to go into an emotional tailspin. It meant that a threat was extended, and the other party would think about it and then come back and maybe come up with a counter threat. And this was part of diplomacy. So an integral part of diplomacy expected by everybody. By the same token, and I think this whole idea that diplomacy is the opposite of war, that no longer holds. It's quite obvious that diplomacy exists before war, alongside war, and after war, and that they're not opposites. Very much so. So I think particularly in Europe, the basic idea here is the medieval idea that when troops went to war, diplomats would be sitting at the back of the wagons, and then the weapons died down and everybody knew the new situation. The diplomats would come down from the wagons and meet and discuss the new situation. This is a powerful image, but what it reads out is that while war is going on, diplomats are very busy indeed. So these days, for example, I'm quite often being asked about what is happening between Ukraine and Russia. And are there contacts? And I can say with my hand upon my heart that I am 100% certain that there will be contacts, either directly or through third parties, for the simple reason that if there were no such contacts, this would be the first time in recorded history that there wouldn't be diplomacy going on alongside the war. So I think this is an important insight. It's so easy to think that diplomacy is the opposite of the war, but that's simply not the case.
Right. One of the very interesting trends, as I see in diplomatic studies, is bringing some social ideas, social approaches to understanding diplomacy. And you've been one of the pioneers in this field, incorporating social approaches into international relations and into understanding diplomacy. So why do you think this social approach is so important? And can we say that that means we need to understand diplomacy not just as a political phenomenon, but first of all, as a social phenomenon. So as a social practice, would you agree with this?
Yes, I would. I would say that it's social and political, definitely. And maybe I should tell how this happened, how I got into this. When I had finished my doctorate, or my first doctorate, which was on Russian-European relations, I started my postdoctoral project, and it was supposed to be about Europaea, about the committee of EU member delegates in Brussels meeting, and there are two Corepaers. There is one for on the ambassadorial level, on the head of mission level, and then there's one on the deputy head of mission level. And I started trying to study this with the tools that I had in my box as a political scientist. And I quickly found out that a lot of the action was simply of a social type that I couldn't capture by using political science models. So I went back to studying anthropology, and I used the anthropological toolbox in order to do what anthropologists would call a village study. That is, I would observe what diplomats did, what they said they did, and the difference between the two. And this became a village study or a community study of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And simply sort of get sort of a handle on the specifics. And a number of things emerged from that, among other things, how different it is to be a diplomat working from your own capital relative to being a diplomat on a posting abroad. Those two things are two very different things. And you do different things, and you think about yourself and the world in different ways when you're doing these things. That was very satisfying indeed. Yes, it was. And I generally think, and this is a bit of a big statement, but I generally think that social science should not only be deductive. We shouldn't only have big theories and then deduct what is going on from that. We should also look at what's actually going on and then induct a model of what's going on. And that's what I try to do with diplomacy. And I'm very satisfied to see that that approach is still very much à la mode in diplomatic studies.
What this social approach, understand diplomacy as a social practice, could mean in practice? Any new kinds of practical approach? What does it mean?
Yes, let me take an example from my own research. A practice can be defined as a socially recognized thing that is being done and that can be done well or badly. So a typical example of a social practice would be to give a speech. And it's a socially recognized thing. We know it when we see it, and we have a number of different expectations about what a speech should be like. And most people who do not know diplomacy would think that a speech would be a way that the speaker would speak to his or her audience in order to convince them about something. So when the Norwegian foreign minister or the Norwegian prime minister enters the stage, takes the floor, and lays out, for example, Norwegian policy on the Middle East, one would have expected that speech to be an attempt at winning hearts and minds of the audience. But that's not necessarily the case, because the speech is more of a sort of poster for this is what we mean today, than it is an attempt at interacting with the audience. And then the question is, how does this happen? How can that be? Because in a number of other speeches that we know of, for example, politicians on the trail, or a speech to a conference of business people, then the idea would be to win hearts and minds. And I looked into this, being a speechwriter myself, and could demonstrate that a key intended audience for a speech by a foreign minister or a speech by anyone from a foreign ministry would be that foreign ministry itself. That so many people in the ministry participate in making the speech that it's becoming to use the same sort of picture once again, it becomes a poster, but this is what we mean, instead of being an outreach to other people. And there is a sense in which all documents coming out of a Ministry of Foreign Affairs are like that. And there are a number of advantages with that. You tell the world what you think. The whole ministry will always speak with one voice. But of course, it is a rather different. It turns out when you look at look at speeches socially as a social practice, they look very different from when you listen to them as part of an audience and think, why aren't they trying to convince me? So they tell us something new about speech, about what a speech is as seen by diplomats. And another example, also from my own research, would be how diplomats dress. It's someone who does not pay attention to this will probably not pick up, for example, that Russian diplomats will never be wearing white tie. Or in the communist states, no communist state would be wearing a black tie, right? Or that Iranians will make a point of not wearing a tie at all, simply because a tie is seen as that you are a so-called fokoli, as the Iranians say, that is, a decadent Westerner. So all these things are interesting. And then I haven't started on the really interesting thing to me, which was, how do women diplomats, female diplomats, dress? Because they have to negotiate a number of expectations that are on them of a national kind, of a gender kind, and also when it comes to age. So they have their work cut out for you. And then you can ask, does this matter? And the answer to this is yes, because every time there's a coverage of diplomatic events, not every time, but quite often, when there is a coverage of diplomatic events, if something goes wrong, if something wears something that people think is indecent, for example, it will be commented on, which means that the diplomatic presentation will not be flawless. So this is something that a number of men take for granted, but I had so many sort of interesting emails from female diplomats when I published an article about this, because they said, finally, a man who understands how much work this takes,
Very interesting. A few years ago, you published a wonderful book, Diplomatic Tenses, a social evolutionary perspective on diplomacy. It's such a interesting book with so many new ideas, but why social evolutionary perspective? As I understand, your point is that diplomacy is a very essential feature of human being as a social being. Essentially, it is a part of a social life. Is that a correct thing?
Definitely, and I'm so glad you are saying that you liked the book, dear colleague, because that book has not had a very broad reception, and we write to be read. So it's nice to hear that I have at least one dedicated reader for that book. Thank you. But one of the key things about that was that diplomats themselves, and also a number of diplomatic scholars, look at how diplomacy unfolds from the inside. So the idea is that diplomats themselves come up with ideas for how to do things, and then they do them this way or that way. And I gave an example earlier in this conversation when it comes to how you run a diplomatic station abroad. There's so many people, and they can be in that way or this way, etc. And it all comes from inside diplomacy itself. But another way of studying change is, of course, to say, how has diplomacy been changed by forces coming from outside diplomacy itself? And that's why I chose an evolutionary perspective on this. And again, the results are interesting. For example, multilateral diplomacy, which is now a mainstay of diplomatic activity, that is diplomacy done by more than two parties. And a number of multilateral diplomatic sites are such that if a new state wants to become a member, you cannot really deny it. If it fulfills the criteria, you have to let them in, which is a very different way of running diplomacy than doing it on a one-on-one basis. And if one looks at how this has happened, it all starts in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna after the Napoleonic Wars, where some parties decide to set up a small body in order to look after trade and commerce on the River Rhine. So the idea is that there shouldn't be too many places where you tax stuff that comes through the river, because then running trade by the river could be unprofitable. And we also need some ways to silt the river to get the bottom layers that it builds up if you do nothing, to get that away so that big boats can come by. And they set up a little organization to do this, and it was the world's first multilateral organization, defined as an organization whose member is states. It's still around, still has a secretariat. But since that time, we now have literally hundreds of thousands of international organizations, multilateral organizations, and they changed the way diplomacy is being done, because a lot of stuff is being done there. And this is not a change that comes from inside diplomacy, it comes from politicians and activity as such, the international relations becoming denser and denser, and somehow one has to have a response to this. It's not enough to have diplomacy inside ministries of foreign affairs. It also has to happen in other places. And then you get a sort of a cover organization for all this, for a number of these international organizations, the League of Nations, and then the League of Nations transmutes into the United Nations, etc. So you simply capture another dynamics of long-term change in diplomacy by looking at it as an evolutionary process where diplomacy reacts to outside forces, instead of looking at diplomacy as something unfolding from within. So that was the most satisfying part of doing that book. Mm-hmm.
How about the importance of visuality, the visual? It was a very interesting part of your book. So how could we now use these ideas about the importance of the visual in order to improve diplomacy's effectiveness, efficiency? Any practical advice you could give?
Yes, I think one thing that is quite striking is how Donald Trump, who was recently elected the new president of the United States, how interested he is in the visual. Typical example would be when President Biden said that the only garbage that he could see, Trump said something about garbage, and Biden says that the only garbage he could see would be Trump's supporters, which is a stupid thing to say for a politician, because you simply don't call people in your own constituency stupid. I mean, if you're a good politician, you don't call anyone stupid, but particularly not your own voters. That's a pretty silly thing to do. What does Trump do? Of course, he gets a big sort of garbage car, paints it as a campaign car, and he himself dons one of these vests, you know, that people handling garbage in the United States will use. So talk about coming across as a man of the people, right? And I see this now also with diplomats, particularly Scandinavian diplomats. Scandinavians are expected to be easygoing. So you will quite often see diplomats addressing crowds and not talking to non-diplomats. They will make a point of not wearing a tie. They will make a point of having an open-necked shirt. And that's supposed to sort of be a folksy kind of thing. And so that's one thing. Another thing, which is rather sort of the opposite, as it were, would be the ritualistic way that that visuals can be used. We all know this from big military sort of exhibitions and shows. For example, on Victory Day in Russia, you would have a big military parade through the streets, and there will be different kinds of weapons, and there will be fumes in red, white, and blue in order to sort of reproduce the Russian flag, etc., etc. And almost all countries indulge in this kind of thing. And there is something about demonstrating that we are a community by the things we're doing, that coordinating people and making big sort of spiels along those lines, that's a very important part of politics. And this aesthetization of politics, a number of people simply don't want to hear about it because they want to discuss politics as deliberation. And we know why, because fascists were so good at the visuals. So I do understand why people are skeptical to it. It would have been nice if Trump sort of was as interested in good arguments as he is in good visuals. But as we've just seen, visuals work. I mean, the visual work is important. And that means that we as who are supposed to study these things, we must study these aspects of politics as well. So I simply think that we shirk our responsibilities as analysts if we don't look at the visuals as well as what's being said.
Right. And perhaps we could also mention the rise of social media, the role of social
Yes,
media in diplomacy, also
yes,
partly connected to visual.
very
So,
much so. I'm glad you said that, because I have 7 kids, and the first ones, they are now in the mid-30s. They were not sort of very much more interested in visuals than I am, but the last 3 or 4, they have consumed so many pictures on their phones and their platforms that they have an immediate and very sophisticated understanding of visuals that I simply didn't have when I was at that age. So you're absolutely right. Social media are very important. There's even something called Snapchat, where the entire thing is about visuals. TikTok is also a very visual platform. So yes, absolutely.
maybe new training programs would arise in diplomatic academies to teach diplomats to use visuals to be more effective.
Very much so. And also, this is an obvious thing to say. It's a bit flat-footed to say it, actually, but the importance of artificial intelligence.
Right.
We are now sort of very familiar with the idea of trolling factories and hacking and all kinds of disinformation on the net. But I would also have thought that there would be a number of other uses for artificial intelligence in diplomatic practice when it comes to spreading different kinds of narratives. And I think this is something that we should study. And thank God our younger colleagues have the chops that it takes to do that. I don't know enough about how these programs are set up, how you do programming, how they work. I don't know enough about all those technical sides to do the job, but I think a number of our younger colleagues do. So this is something where we will see, I think, very interesting work in the years to come.
Right. And I know you published several books and quite a few articles where you discussed diplomacy as a handling others. So the self idea as a self and other was perhaps one of the very important elements in your development of your ideas about diplomacy. So conceptualizing diplomacy through the ideas of self and other, the relationship. But in this respect, I have a question about how about handling yourself? For example,
Yes.
not just handling others.
Mhm.
Perhaps, of course, you know that, for example, Confucius, he said that to manage others, you need, first of all, to manage yourself. So handling yourself is a key for handling others. But I don't think that such an approach has any place in our understanding of diplomacy. So the
Ah,
point is that very important aspect of diplomacy, of being effective diplomats, is handling yourself.
yes.
About that, how you could handle others. So do
Mhm.
you have any maybe reflection on this, handling
Ve-
others yourself?
Very much so. I mean, to a number of diplomats, the ground rule of diplomacy is don't antagonize your opponent unnecessarily. And one of the reasons why I'm not a diplomat myself, I have actually been invited to become one, but I declined. And one of the reasons is that in order to be a good diplomat, you have to put yourself out of the picture. And this is very hard to do. We all have things that can rile us, that can get us sort of into some kind of strong emotional mood. And if we don't have any control of that, we shouldn't be. And the more control you have of that, the better it is. Of course, no one is a machine. If you're an automaton, you are not a good diplomat either, that you have to have color as a person. But the more control you have of yourself, definitely the better. And I do think that we have some work on this in diplomatic studies for the people who are using Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, talking about habitus. And people like Vincent Pouliot, people like Cornu and Rebecca Adler-Nissen, they are interested in how the control of the body and how the comportment of the body actually works, and how you have yourself under control. For example, in the European tradition, aristocrats are famously slow in their movements. You're supposed to be, that's a way of being sort of above, and that's to demonstrate that you have good time, you know, and you have control over yourself, you control over your body, you know exactly what's going on. There are a number of problems here. I agree with you that we should definitely study it, and my studies of clothing would be an example of this, because clothes are, of course, part of the impression you make on others. But we have a huge and very interesting challenge here, which is that the kind of body language and the kind of facial expressions that work in one culture may not work in other cultures. So, for example, Indonesians, the control of the body should include a total control of the face, so that you should be able to sort of make faces that reflect nothing, right? And this is very hard for a Westerner to do, you know. I mean, another example that I have lived, as it were, is what Russians call bytovaya russkaya neulibchivost. You know, the Russian the idea of that Russians should be unsmiling, that, you know, you don't smile. And if you don't smile in a Western context, it can very easily become a sign of hostility. So this cannot necessarily be intended, but it could be very, very upsetting for a diplomatic relation. So I think the comportment of self here is super interesting, but I think it's an extension of the relationship between self and others in how we study it, because when we have comportment and control of ourselves, it is, of course, to make a certain kind of impression on others. So again, we cannot extricate the self from the other, as it were. But I look forward to seeing more work on this. Absolutely, I agree with you.
Oh, thank you. And one of your wonderful ideas in your last book was securitization versus diplomatization. So can you please say a little bit about this?
Well, this was an idea that I took directly from the so-called Copenhagen School of Security Studies. Right. This idea that when you call something a question of security, you securitize it. It means that you say that this is a part of politics that is so important that we have to use a number of other tools, then we have to treat it in very different ways institutionally. And as we all know, we talked about it when it came to speech writing, if you institutionalize something in a certain way, that impinges directly on the results that the processes institutionalized will actually produce. So when it comes to a hot conflict, the conflict that is simmering, let's say, you could securitize it further and even violize it, if you like. You know, you could make it a question of using force. The alternative is to try and use diplomatic means in order to diffuse the situation. And I think every good diplomat knows this and always tries to handle this. My wife, who is also my collaborator on a couple of articles, has written an interesting article in the European Journal of International Relations, where she and a colleague discuss a therapeutic way of handling the world called containment, not containment as we had it during the Cold War, but to contain a situation in the sense of getting a grip on it, getting a handle on it, and then diffuse it. And their argument is that this is something that diplomats know how to do much better than all other bureaucrats. And they take the example as of childcare as an example. This has become, given that the world is becoming a smaller place, given more transnational marriages, we have a number of situations where children are being taken by one parent to live in a country without the consent of another parent. And this is the sort of stuff that leads to diplomatic crises. And what my wife, Cecily Besper Neumann, and her colleague, Kirsten Haugevik, do in that article is to demonstrate how people in childcare, bureaucrats working with childcare, are not able to contain the situation in the same way that diplomats are doing. That when diplomats come in and try to calm this down, they have a lot of diplomatic tools, and sometimes they're not even aware of them themselves, in order to simply calm the situation and making social spaces, as it were. I find that very interesting.
Very
Diplomats, this idea that diplomats, to diplomaticize a process, that diplomats have a number of these ways of making social productive arenas that they themselves are not necessarily aware of. That they simply know how to do it. It's an embodied thing, you know.
You know, traditionally, we used to understand diplomacy as a part of or mechanism or tool or means of providing security or having security. But when you put versus, and for me, it is kind of going towards more human diplomacy, humanitization of diplomacy. So it's not just related to the idea of security, which is of course very important still, but also more towards a human understanding or humanistic approach to diplomacy when we put this versus good social relationship, human relationship, which could be based on bringing more diplomacy to society, perhaps.
I think this is at the present juncture where the world order is changing, and we get a situation where 6 billion people who are not living in the West get the say that they deserve, and the changing rules that come with that. Things are changing, and I think one very important thing to remember there, and is that diplomacy is, of course, about the national interests and getting through your program and getting other people to do what they otherwise wouldn't have done. It's a way of bending people's arms, if you like. I think it was Lester Pearson who defined diplomacy as the art of getting somebody else to have it your way, which is quite nice. But diplomacy is not only about ramming through the national interest, it's also about cooperation that makes that national interest qualitatively more expensive. So if two countries are able to clinch a deal where both win, that is a boon for humanity as such. And good diplomats have always known this, that if you make a deal where you see to it that both parties are happy, then that deal will last longer and will produce more than a deal that is simply a result of clashing national interests, and you find some kind of least common denominator. And this is one of the things that worry me in the world of practice these days. If you look at someone like President-elect Trump, they think about the world, and including diplomacy, as what a game theorist would call one-off games, that it's all about winning here and now. And then it's about winning the next time and the next time. Another way of thinking about the world and diplomacy is that we are faced with a number of what a game theorist would call iterative games. That, you know, you have a number of these games where we meet the same agents, the same actors would meet. And maybe if I sort of do not force a point one day, I can get something easier the next day. And it's interesting for me why populists do not understand this, because usually they're married, so they know that in order to get a marriage to work, sometimes you have to renege a bit on your immediate demands in order to get your demands in other ways and your desires met in other sort of arenas. So it's a complex game. It's an iterative game. It's not a one-off. And I simply think that we would make diplomacy a poorer practice. I think it would be a step back for diplomacy if we follow the populists and think about diplomacy as a game here and now that is about to win, and then tomorrow there's a new game that we will also win, instead of having a more long drawn out understanding that cooperation may actually move the whole field. But I suppose it's easy to stand and brag in front of people that I got the best deals and I won again and then I won again, etc., etc. But it makes for I think, a poorer life world for all of us.
Yeah,
as you can hear, I'm a bit of a liberal.
Well, for me, it's my understanding. I see clearly very political diplomacy, which is a part of state-based diplomacy. International politics and foreign policy. But we could also approach diplomacy from mostly social perspective, which is social diplomacy, which is not necessarily has a heavily political elements. Of course, it's very difficult to distinguish political and social, but nevertheless, so more politically oriented diplomacy, which exists in international relations, international politics, but also we could speak and develop more socially oriented diplomacy, which is more human, more people to people, more less oriented to politics.
I would agree. And we have colleagues, for example, Kostas Konstantinou, who's made it his life's work in order to excavate these kinds of things. The only thing that my footnote to all this would be that we should not forget that diplomacy is also about getting the national interest through. So it's not a question of idealism here. It's a question. It's not necessarily a question of idealism. It's a question of having two practices, the one about winning deals and the other one about sort of say baking another cake that we could share, so that it's an old chestnut, you know, it's about conflict and cooperation, not only about conflict.
So we are living in a very challenging time. How do you see the role of diplomacy?
Well, I think it's more important than ever, a very important role, because the more interaction we have, people are now talking about a rolling back of globalization, but relations are denser than they have ever been before. Here the two of us are, one in Tashkent, one in Oslo, having a real-time conversation with pictures. I mean, this is something that when we were boys, we wouldn't have, I mean, this was a science fiction thing, right? Now it happens in real time. Here we are. And we talked about transnational marriages and the kind of things that will sort of bring with it. There will be a certain reaction to this now. Politicians like Modi and Putin and Xi and Trump, they are all sort of talking about a de-risking or a sort of a folding back of globalization. But I think it's very hard to see a return to how things were 50 years ago. It would take a collapse to bring of the system to bring about that. What I see is that we have a reaction to globalization, but I don't see it sort of evaporating in any way. And this means that the interfaces, the interstices between different polities will be denser and denser. And what do we call people who are specializing in working those seams, in handling those relations? We call them diplomats. So I think the future of diplomacy is bright.
Okay, very good idea. So what do you think, what could be and should be done in order to bring close practice and theory, diplomatic study and diplomatic practice?
I have two comments there. One is that I think Christopher Hill and Pamela Bischoff's book on the two worlds of international relations is still apposite, in the sense that there are differences between theorists and practitioners, and it's a good thing that they rub shoulders. And I think a number of us who are working in diplomatic studies should make a point of talking and writing in ways so that we can have practicing diplomats amongst our readers. And I think it's a very good thing that we are being invited to address diplomatic academies and partake in diplomatic conferences, etc. So in that sense, I think you're right that it's a good thing that we come together. But having said that, I'm also impressed with the German philosopher Heidegger, who is talking about there being two different ways of thinking. One way is the way we think when we stand in the middle of a situation. We have to do something. When you're practicing as a diplomat, for example, you're in a conversation and you talked about handling yourself, keep your calm, not being hot under the collar, bum, 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 bum. Some idea will come up, you will respond by an idea. The way you think then is on your hoof, as it were, on your feet, as it were. You take things from there. Then that would be what he calls thinking, but then there would be what he calls after thinking, nachdenken, thinking after the fact. And that would be what the two of us are doing. We are sitting in our studies, thinking, this happened, and that happened, and this happened, and that happened. Now, what does this teach us? What does this show us? What are the differences? How do these things change? This way of using our heads is simply very different. We can sit calmly, we can take a break, we can go and have a cup of coffee and a cigarette, we can talk to other people about it, and then we can act by writing an article. If we follow Heidegger, this is a very different way of being and thinking in the world as the one of the practitioner. And here comes the point. This is exactly as it should be. So there's a division of labor here. One thing is to conduct diplomatic relations. Then you have to think sort of on your feet and take things on the hoof, as it were. Another thing is to sit back calmly and analyze and find out, how did these people react? How did they do? Did they do it optimally? Or did they have any other choices, etc.? It's very important to remember that you cannot simply say then that the diplomat who was conducting diplomacy should have done this or should have done that, because he or she was in a very different situation where they had to think immediately, just like we have now in our conversation. And that is a very different way of using your head. So I think that the practitioner and the theorist never will meet in this sense, and they shouldn't meet either. So if they become one, that means that we have lost the theorists, and we don't want to do that.
Well, we also may consider that diplomats are part of this government bureaucracy, and they are not very much free to express themselves. They have a lot of limitation in their behavior. So, but at the same time, scholars are much more free to say something, to write something. So they are living in a very different world.
Yes.
So perhaps I would like to see diplomats to be more relaxed, more curious, more expressive, which will make them more efficient. But it's easy to say, but in fact, they are working under certain rules and conditions, and that's a part of their job. And it's very difficult to change. I don't know.
It is very difficult to change. It's in the final analysis, it's impossible to change because diplomats are by definition representatives of their collectives. So they are not free to act as they choose. That does not mean that they cannot be curious. A good diplomat is curious and takes in a lot of stuff. But of course, I have a number of friends that are diplomats, and it's interesting to see how they shape how this job shapes them as human beings. They will rarely sort of react spontaneously to what you're saying. They will think, and then they will say something guarded. And I think this is probably something that has to be like it is. I try to make a point of following popular culture representations of diplomacy because this is the way most people think about diplomacy. And there is now a show out that is called The Diplomats. It's an American show. And the star is an American female ambassador to the court of St. James, to London. And she does not have herself under control at all. And she's always talking about a personal agenda, which means that this is a rather bad TV show. They hadn't really sort of caught the gist of diplomacy, as it were. And I can assure you, dear colleague, that you wouldn't like diplomats to act as she is doing.
Right. But I spent myself some time in diplomacy. I've seen, if I may say, two types of diplomats. One is very official, very controlled, very serious. But the other type is very relaxed, very interesting people, absolutely wonderful personalities with jokes, sometimes spontaneous behavior. So how to bring these two things together? On the one hand, your personality, your unique, but on the other hand, of course, your efficiency as a part of government. That's, of course, not an easy thing, but both things are very important, I believe.
I totally agree. But on the other hand, a note of caution, a diplomatic service that only consisted of people with big personalities and lots of spontaneity would be a pretty tough organization to run. And it would be pretty hard to find people to send to places where you really need to know exactly what you're doing at every point. For example, North Korea. So in the final analysis, again, I think we need both to have a diplomatic service. But of course, for those of us who are researchers, it's always very nice when people are spontaneous and outgoing because it makes for so much more interesting material.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, for your insights. As usual, it's so many new ideas and wonderful, unique social approach to diplomacy. It's great to have you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. It would have even been better to. It would have been even better to be in Tashkent, but it's also very good to be on your show. Thank you.
I hope you will visit us. It would be a great honor for us to receive you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.